Husband and wife lock and starve the old mother in an iron cage, and the ending was satisfying. I remember the smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh laundry whenever I visited my grandma's house. Her name was Margaret Dawson, though everyone in Willow Creek just called her Miss Maggie. She was the kind of woman who always had an extra plate at the dinner table, always had time for a neighbor's troubles, and always smiled like life hadn't beaten her more times than it should have. But this isn't about what she was. It's about what they did to her. Margaret's life had been a series of sacrifices. She married young to a factory worker named Henry Dawson. They had one child, Daniel. When Henry died in a machinery accident in 1983, Margaret didn't crumble. She rolled up her sleeves and made life work. She cleaned homes, stitched quilts, and worked as a school cafeteria lady just to make ends meet. Daniel was her world. She put every ounce of love into raising him right. And he was a good kid, or at least he used to be. Daniel grew up, went to college, and became an accountant in the city. Margaret was proud. She'd sit on the porch in her faded rocking chair, sipping sweet tea and showing off pictures of Daniel in a suit. "He's making something of himself," she'd say to the neighbors. When he brought Melissa home, his new wife, Margaret was all smiles. Melissa was sharp-looking with perfect posture, blonde highlights, and a designer purse she wouldn't put down. She was polite enough at first, but there was something in her smile that never quite reached her eyes. Still, Margaret welcomed her into the house she and Henry had built with their bare hands. "Stay as long as you like," Margaret had said. "This home is yours now too." Maybe that was her first mistake. Daniel and Melissa moved in just for a while they looked for a place of their own. Weeks turned into months. Margaret didn't complain. She cooked. She cleaned. She gave them the master bedroom and moved into the smaller guest room. But things started changing. Melissa started making comments. Subtle jabs at first. "You sure you want her cooking all that greasy stuff with your cholesterol, Daniel? I think she forgot she already told us that story. She's up too early. I couldn't sleep with all her noise." Daniel, who once used to kiss his mother on the cheek every morning, started pulling away. He stopped laughing at her stories. He stopped asking for her advice. Soon Melissa was speaking for both of them. "We're trying to eat cleaner. We need our privacy. She needs to rest more anyway." Then came the locked pantry. The reduced portions. The cold shoulders. Margaret's world began shrinking inside the very home she once ruled with warmth. One night, Tom Richards, the neighbor from 2 houses down, noticed Margaret sitting outside on the back steps, wrapped in a thin blanket. It was early November. The wind was brutal. "Miss Maggie," he asked. "You all right?" "Oh, I'm just giving the young couple some space. Melissa says I watch too much news with the volume up." Tom frowned. "You want me to get you anything?" She shook her head with a forced smile. "They take good care of me." But he knew something wasn't right. She was losing weight. Her eyes looked sunken, and her shoulders slumped like she was carrying more than just age. Tom had known Daniel since he was a kid. He couldn't believe he'd let things get this bad. So what could he do? No one imagined it would get worse. That it would turn into something dark. That they would build a cage. That this sweet, selfless woman would one day be locked away like an animal in her own backyard. But that's the thing about monsters. They don't always come snarling and stomping. Sometimes they wear wedding rings and say grace before dinner. And sometimes the worst ones call you Mom. By winter, the warmth in Margaret's home had all but vanished. The laughter that once bounced off her living room walls, Daniel cracking jokes, Margaret humming while baking, the occasional visit from Tom and his dog, was gone. The air in the Dawson household had grown tense, cold, and heavy with silence. Melissa was at the center of it. She took over the kitchen first, reorganizing the cabinets, tossing out Margaret's beloved cast iron skillet for a sleeker, stainless steel set. Then came the living room, where she replaced family photos with abstract art prints and moved Margaret's floral recliner into the garage without asking. "I'm just modernizing things," she told Daniel one evening while he scrolled mindlessly on his phone. Margaret didn't argue. She wasn't confrontational. But the hurt was visible in her eyes as she sat alone, knitting quietly in her small room. The house may have still technically belonged to her, but piece by piece, Melissa was stripping away everything that made it feel like home. Soon Melissa started planting doubts in Daniel's mind. "I think your mom's memory is getting worse," she whispered one night after dinner. She asked me the same question 3 times today. What if she forgets to turn off the stove? What if she wanders off? Daniel furrowed his brow. She's just getting older. That happens. Melissa leaned in, touching his hand. I'm just worried about her. You work so hard. You deserve peace of mind. It wasn't long before those whispers turned into long talks about responsibility, safety, and eventually, control. Melissa convinced Daniel to take over the finances, just to relieve Mom of the burden. She talked him into switching the house deed into both of their names, just in case something happened to her. Margaret, ever trusting of her son, signed the papers without hesitation. Soon after, Melissa started monitoring Margaret's medication. I don't think she's taking them properly, she told the doctor over the phone, while Margaret stood nearby, confused and ashamed. She's forgetful. She says strange things sometimes. Margaret protested once, gently. Melissa, I've been managing my own medicine for years. Melissa gave her a tight smile. That's exactly the problem, Maggie. Daniel, who once would have stood up for his mother without question, simply nodded. Let Melissa help Mom. She means well. And then just before Christmas came the final blow. Margaret's church friends stopped calling. The landline was mysteriously disconnected. Her phone charger got lost, and when she asked to use Daniel's phone, Melissa said it was charging, on a call, or dead. Days passed without contact from the outside world. Tom noticed. He stopped by with a fruitcake one Sunday afternoon. Margaret home? He asked, peering past Melissa's shoulder. She's resting, Melissa replied curtly. Doctor's orders. She's not doing too well these days. It's best if people don't get her too worked up. Tom raised an eyebrow. She seemed fine last I saw her. Melissa gave a tight-lipped smile. Yes, well, old age is unpredictable. Behind her, Margaret stood silently in the hallway watching them. Her eyes pleaded, but she said nothing. Tom saw her, but before he could wave, the door was shut. That night, Margaret cried herself to sleep in a room that used to belong to her. She clutched a photo of Henry and whispered, I miss you so much. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Daniel and Melissa were already planning what came next. I just don't feel comfortable leaving her alone when we're at work, Melissa said. She's not a child, Daniel replied half-heartedly. She needs to be watched. It's either that or we send her to a facility. Daniel sighed. You know she'd never agree to that. Melissa crossed her arms, her voice ice cold. Then we'll have to take matters into our own hands. And just like that, the final piece of their plan clicked into place. What began as quiet control was about to turn into full-blown cruelty. Anne Margaret, sweet, trusting Margaret, had no idea that her only child had already chosen a side. The first snowfall of January came quietly, blanketing Willow Creek in a soft, deceptive peace. The town's rooftops shimmered in white. Children built snowmen. Lights still flickered on porches left over from the holidays. But at the Dawson home, something darker was taking shape. Out behind the house, there was an old storage shed Daniel had built with Henry years ago. It was sturdy, weather-worn but solid, and barely used anymore. Just old tools, shelves of forgotten paint cans, and dusty tarps piled in the corners. Melissa had an idea. We could clear it out, reinforce the door, and lock it. That way she'll be safe when we're not home, she said one night as they stood in the kitchen. She'll have her own space and we can finally have ours. Daniel hesitated. You want to lock my mother in the shed? Melissa exhaled sharply. It's not like that. You make it sound cruel. It's temporary, just until we figure out what's best. She keeps wandering at night. She could slip on the stairs. You said yourself we can't leave her alone. Daniel rubbed his face. She'll be heartbroken. Melissa softened her voice. I know it's hard, but this is about safety. We can put a heater in there. A bed. Some blankets. It's better than a nursing home, isn't it? In the end, it wasn't love, that one. It was pressure, fear, and guilt, manipulated just right. That weekend, Daniel cleared the shed. He screwed thick metal bars into the windows for security. Melissa brought in a cot, a blanket, and a space heater. They added a small table and a dim lamp. Then Daniel reinforced the door with a padlock. He didn't call it what it was. He told himself it was just a temporary arrangement. The next morning, Margaret sat at the kitchen table sipping warm tea when Daniel entered. Mom, he said softly, we need to talk. She looked up, her smile faint but hopeful. Of course, sweetheart. He sat across from her, avoiding her eyes. Melissa and we think it's time you had your own space. Somewhere safe. Somewhere quiet. Margaret blinked, confused. What do you mean? This is my home. It still is, Daniel said quickly. There have been some incidents. You left the front door open last week. And the stove. I didn't. Margaret stopped, her voice trembling. I remember turning it off. It's okay, Daniel said, patting her hand. Melissa and I just want what's best. We set up the old shed for you. You'll have your own space. Your privacy. Margaret stared at him, silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. You want me to live in the shed? Just for a while. Until we figure things out. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, stood and walked to her room. That night, Daniel helped her carry her things. Just a few clothes, her knitting bag and the photo of Henry. Margaret paused at the threshold of the shed, shivering as the wind cut through her sweater. It's only temporary, Daniel said. She stepped inside. He placed a hand on her shoulder, then turned and left. He didn't hear her whisper, I raised you better than this. From that day forward, Margaret lived in the shed. The door was locked from the outside. Melissa brought her food twice a day. A paper plate of plain rice, toast, sometimes a boiled egg. The heater worked when it wanted to. Some nights were colder than others. Tom, the neighbor, noticed the light on in the shed. He noticed the back door never opened for Margaret anymore. He noticed she wasn't on the porch knitting or tending her garden. He grew suspicious. One afternoon, while Melissa and Daniel were away, he walked over. He tapped the side of the shed softly. Miss Maggie? You in there? Nothing. He tried again. Ma'am, it's Tom. You all right? A faint sound. Shuffling. Then a raspy voice. Tom. His chest tightened. Maggie, are you locked in there? She didn't answer. But he already knew. The next day, Tom installed a small hidden camera facing the shed. He knew it was risky. But he had to see what was going on. What he captured over the next week would chill him to the bone. Tom Richards couldn't sleep. Ever since he'd heard Margaret's frail voice from behind the shed wall, something inside him hadn't settled. His gut kept turning, and every time he tried to rest, all he could hear was her quiet, broken Tom. So he acted. He purchased a small motion-activated security camera from the local hardware store and mounted it behind the big oak tree in his yard, angled just enough to catch a clear view of the Dawsons' shed without being obvious. The lens peered directly at the entrance, capturing every shadow, every movement. Tom checked the footage every evening like clockwork. He told his wife he was just tinkering with tech, but deep down he knew he was looking for evidence. And he found it. The first video showed Melissa unlocking the shed door mid-morning. She shoved a paper plate through the small hatch they'd carved out at the bottom, barely enough room for a hand to fit. Then she locked the door again and walked away without a glance. Margaret never came out. The next day the same thing. No interaction. No conversation. Just a locked door, a plastic fork, and silence. Then came the night video. It was 2:13 a.m., snow falling gently. The wind howling through the trees. The camera picked up a soft flickering from inside the shed, probably the dying heater. Tom leaned closer to the screen. And then he saw it. Margaret's face appeared in the small, barred window. Pale, sunken, and worn. She stared out into the night, eyes glassy, mouth moving slowly. No sound, but Tom could read the words on her lips. Please. God, help me. His hands shook. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. That shed wasn't just a safe space. It was a prison. And Margaret wasn't just being taken care of. She was being punished, starved, and forgotten. The next morning, Tom printed out the still frames. He needed help. He needed someone who would take this seriously. He remembered hearing Margaret talk about a niece, Emily, a lawyer from Chicago. It had been years, but Tom had a good memory. He found her contact through an old Christmas letter Margaret had proudly shared with neighbors one holiday. He made the call. Emily Dawson answered the phone groggily. It was early. Hello. Hi, I hope this isn't too strange. My name is Tom Richards. I live next door to your Aunt Margaret. I think something terrible is happening. There was a pause. What do you mean? Tom explained everything. The shed. The videos. Margaret's decline. Emily listened in silence, then asked him to send the footage. Within the hour, she had a folder full of horrifying evidence sitting in her inbox. He watched every second. She saw her aunt, her sweet, story-loving, Christmas card-writing Aunt Margaret, curled up in a corner, wearing a torn sweater and mumbling to herself. She saw Daniel, her cousin, deliver a cold silence that pierced like glass. And she saw Melissa, arms folded, eyes hard, treating Margaret like an animal. Emily felt rage boiling in her chest. She hadn't spoken to Margaret in a few years. Life had gotten in the way. But she had loved her dearly growing up. Margaret used to send her knitted scarves every winter. She never missed a birthday card. And now, this? Emily booked the next flight out. 2 days later, she stood on the Dawson front porch, suitcase in hand. The house looked the same. White picket fence, birdhouse in the yard, wreath on the door, but it no longer felt like a home. Melissa opened the door, surprised. Emily? Oh wow, what a surprise. What brings you here? Emily smiled politely. Just passing through for work. Thought I'd visit Aunt Margaret. Is she home? Melissa stiffened just slightly. Oh, she's not feeling well. Sleeping a lot lately. Doctor's orders. I don't mind waiting, Emily said calmly. I brought her some tea. It's her favorite, spiced orange. Melissa forced a smile. Well, let me check with Daniel. He's upstairs. Emily stepped inside and looked around. The house had changed. Cold tones, minimalist decor, not a single family photo in sight. When Daniel appeared, he looked shocked. Emily? What are you doing here? She smiled. Missed my aunt. Daniel hesitated. She's resting. Emily nodded. In the shed. The color drained from Daniel's face. What? Emily stepped closer. You locked your mother in a shed, Daniel. There are videos. I've seen them all. You lied to everyone, including yourselves. Melissa stepped forward, defensive. We were protecting her. She was declining. We did what we had to. No, Emily snapped. You did what was convenient. She pulled out her phone, already recording. And now I'm going to do what's right. Then she turned and walked out, calling 911 as she stepped off the porch. Behind her, Daniel and Melissa stood frozen. Their secret was out. And justice was coming. The officers arrived within 15 minutes. It didn't take long for them to understand the gravity of what was happening. Emily met them in the front yard, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. Her voice didn't shake. She was calm, controlled, and furious. My aunt is locked in a shed behind this house, she said. They said she's in a nursing home. That's a lie. I have video proof and she's back there right now. Starving. Dying. The lead officer nodded and motioned for his partner to follow. They moved quickly through the snow-covered yard to the shed. Daniel tried to stop them. She's confused sometimes. You don't understand. Step aside, sir. Melissa stood on the porch, arms folded tightly across her chest, her mouth a thin line of tension. The officers reached the shed, knocked once, then yanked the lock. What they found inside made one of them swear under his breath. Margaret Dawson was curled in the corner, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, trembling. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound, but she didn't speak. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale and dry, and her breathing was shallow. One of the officers called for medical assistance immediately. The other knelt beside her. Ma'am, you're safe now. Help is here. She blinked, tears welling in her eyes. Her voice was weak. Henry, is that you? Emily stood at the shed's entrance, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The smell of damp wood and decay made her stomach turn, but she didn't flinch. I'm here, Aunt Margaret, she whispered. I'm so sorry it took me this long. An ambulance took Margaret to Willow Creek General Hospital. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from hypothermia. Doctors said if another day had passed, she might not have made it. Emily stayed by her bedside the entire night, holding her hand, stroking her hair, whispering stories from her childhood to keep her calm. I still have that scarf you made me, she said softly. The blue one with the crooked edge. I wore it every day that first winter in Chicago. Margaret didn't respond, but she gripped Emily's hand tightly. Meanwhile, the police were interviewing Daniel and Melissa. Melissa tried to maintain control, claiming they were overwhelmed caregivers, just trying to keep a confused old woman safe. She blamed Margaret's paranoia and mental decline, insisting the shed was simply temporary housing until they could find a nursing home. Daniel, however, cracked under pressure. He admitted to moving his mother to the shed after Melissa pushed for more space. He admitted to taking over her finances, forging her signature on several documents, and lying to friends and neighbors about her well-being. "I just wanted peace," he said, his voice low. "Melissa said she was getting worse. I believed her. But I didn't know it was this bad." The detectives didn't buy the excuses. The footage Tom Richards had collected was enough on its own to charge both of them. Combined with financial records and testimony from neighbors, the case against Daniel and Melissa was airtight. They were arrested that same evening, charged with elder abuse, neglect, unlawful imprisonment, and attempted manslaughter. The story spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up first, then state channels, then national. Elderly woman found starved and locked in backyard shed by son and daughter-in-law. From kindness to cruelty, how a son betrayed his own mother. The town of Willow Creek buzzed with outrage. People who'd once waved politely at Daniel and Melissa now spat their names in disgust. Stores took down the Dawson family Christmas donation plaques. The church revoked their membership. And through it all, Margaret lay in her hospital bed, slowly healing. Tom visited one afternoon, holding a small bouquet of white carnations. "I'm so sorry, Miss Maggie," he whispered. "I should have spoken up sooner." She reached for his hand. Her voice was still frail, but there was strength in it now. "You saved my life, Tom. That's more than enough." Emily extended her leave from work in Chicago. She filed for emergency guardianship, and within days she was granted full legal authority over Margaret's affairs. The house was sealed for investigation. Bank accounts frozen. The community rallied around Emily and her aunt, offering casseroles, blankets, even fundraising to cover medical bills. But Emily didn't want pity. She wanted justice. And she was just getting started. 3 weeks after Margaret was rescued, she was discharged from the hospital. Though still frail, her spirit had begun to flicker back to life. Emily had moved her into a small rental home just outside town. A bright, warm space with big windows, soft blankets, and quiet. Margaret sat by the window most mornings, wrapped in a knitted shawl Emily had found tucked away in the attic of the Dawson house. She watched birds flutter past and whispered little prayers under her breath. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid to close her eyes. But while Margaret healed, Emily prepared for war. She'd never practiced criminal law, but she knew enough. And she had connections. She brought in a former classmate, Angela Price, a seasoned elder abuse prosecutor from Cleveland. Together they began building a case not just to punish Daniel and Melissa, but to set an example for every hidden act of cruelty masquerading as caregiving. The evidence was overwhelming. The video footage from Tom's hidden camera. Photos of the cage-like shed and padlock. Margaret's hospital records showing clear signs of starvation and hypothermia. The forged financial documents. Testimonies from neighbors like Tom, Mrs. Pennington, who hadn't seen Margaret since Thanksgiving, and the mailman who had noticed her favorite garden chair collecting dust. Emily also found a journal in Margaret's nightstand, a small cloth-covered notebook with shaky handwriting and tear stains across the pages. In it, Margaret had written daily prayers, thoughts, and little notes of confusion and fear. "I don't think Daniel sees me anymore. Melissa says I'm forgetful. I remember everything. The shed is cold. I dreamed of Henry again. Please God, let this be over soon." Emily read the pages with trembling hands. This wasn't just a legal case. It was a human wound that needed to be exposed. The trial date was set for early spring. The courthouse in Willow Creek had never seen anything like it. Reporters set up outside. Protesters stood with signs, "Protect our elders" and "Justice for Margaret." Local news vans parked on Main Street. The town was quiet, angry, and watching. Daniel arrived in handcuffs, eyes downcast, dressed in a rumpled gray suit. Melissa came in separately, sunglasses covering her face, lips pressed into a tight, defiant line. Emily sat beside Margaret in the front row. Margaret wore a simple lavender dress, her gray hair neatly pinned back, and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes, though weary, were steady. The courtroom fell silent as the judge entered. The prosecution made its case methodically. Every video, photo, and record was presented with haunting clarity. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Tom's voice cracked as he recalled hearing Margaret's voice behind the shed wall. Mrs. Pennington wept as she described Margaret's generosity, how she'd brought her soup during chemo and helped her paint her fence last summer. Angela Price closed the day with a quiet, piercing statement. Margaret Dawson didn't need a nurse. She needed her son to love her. Instead, he and his wife sentenced her to a silent, slow death just feet from the home she built. That's not neglect. That's cruelty. And cruelty deserves justice. The defense scrambled. Melissa's attorney painted her as an overwhelmed wife, trying to protect her home. Daniel's lawyer claimed he had relied too heavily on his wife's judgment. But the jury wasn't moved, especially when Emily took the stand. She spoke with calm conviction. About growing up with Margaret's letters. About receiving her hand-knitted scarves every year. About the woman who used to sing lullabies and send prayer cards. She read directly from Margaret's journal. I keep asking myself, what did I do wrong? Why does my son hate me now? A few jurors wiped tears from their eyes. By the time Emily stepped down, the silence in the room was no longer heavy with tension. It was brimming with fury. Outside the courthouse, people lit candles. Some left cards for Margaret. Others simply offered hugs. Margaret didn't speak much. But she didn't need to. Her presence, small, quiet, and unbroken, spoke volumes. And everyone knew. Something had shifted. This wasn't just about Margaret anymore. This was about every elderly person whose cries went unheard. Every parent cast aside when they became inconvenient. Every voice locked behind closed doors. It took the jury only 4 hours to return with a verdict. The courtroom was packed, standing room only. Journalists had flown in from as far as New York. Local students sat in the gallery, clutching notebooks, studying the case for school projects. Retirees, churchgoers, caregivers, all sat with bated breath, waiting. Daniel stood in his wrinkled suit, eyes dark with fatigue and fear. Melissa stood beside her attorney, spine straight, chin high, as if she still believed she could spin her way out of the mess she'd created. Margaret sat in the front row, flanked by Emily and Tom. Her hand trembled slightly in Emily's, but her gaze never wavered. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. The judge entered. All rise. As everyone stood, the jury foreman, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, cleared his throat and began. In the matter of State versus Daniel Dawson and Melissa Dawson, we, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts. Guilty of elder abuse. Guilty of unlawful imprisonment. Guilty of attempted manslaughter. Gasps rippled across the room. Melissa's face turned pale. Daniel's knees buckled slightly and he gripped the defense table for support. The judge nodded, her expression firm. Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, she said, you stole years of love, peace, and dignity from a woman who gave you everything. You exploited her trust, stole her freedom, and nearly stole her life. And for that, this court sentences you both to 25 years in state prison, without the possibility of parole. Margaret let out a soft breath. A release. Like something deep inside her had finally uncoiled. Melissa collapsed into her chair, stunned. Daniel said nothing. He couldn't. There were no words left. Only regret, and the long, cold road ahead. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. As Daniel and Melissa were escorted into separate police vans, the crowd remained silent. No jeers. No shouting. Just quiet. Judgment had already been passed by the law and by the people. Over the following days, letters flooded in for Margaret. Strangers wrote to her from all over the country. Former teachers, retired nurses, people who had lived similar horrors. They called her a hero. A survivor. A symbol. One letter stood out. It was from a woman in Nebraska who had also been locked away by her children, rescued just months before her death. The note read, "You survived, Miss Margaret. You survived and you spoke. And in doing so you gave the rest of us a voice. Thank you." Emily arranged for the Dawson family home to be transferred into Margaret's name again. After the trial, she filed a civil suit against Daniel and Melissa, reclaiming every stolen asset. With community help, she began renovations on the house, not for Margaret's return but for something bigger. She had a vision. Margaret's haven. A sanctuary for elderly individuals who had been abused or abandoned by their families. A place where they could heal, share stories, drink tea on the porch and knit by the fire without fear. It started small. 3 rooms. 1 nurse. A couple of donated recliners. But the spirit behind it, Margaret's spirit, made it feel like home. 1 year after the verdict, a documentary premiered on national television, The Margaret Dawson Story. It was watched by millions. It won awards. Changed lives. And Margaret? She watched it with Emily by her side, a soft blanket on her lap and a warm smile on her lips. Not because she was famous, but because she had finally been seen, heard, believed.